And in about a minute, I will have the link to drop into the chat and onto the schedule. So hey, how's everybody doing? What's the haps? What's cool or not cool, as the case may be? And on, you know what? Actually, let me do one other thing. I want to make sure this is set up right, and I don't know that it is. Okay, there we go. All right, that should be better. All right, everyone can still hear me, right? We're still good on audio? At least coming from me to the schedule. All
Yeah, I
right.
can
So
hear you
hey,
just
how's
fine.
everybody doing? What's the haps? I don't know that. All right, that should be better. I'm just doing a quick sound check. All right, everyone can still hear me, right? We're still good on audio? At least coming from me to the schedule. Okay, that's coming through good. All right, man. Let's do it. No, I know, Stephen, but that was a good one. I think it was a good one. It bears repeating. There.
True, it's pretty.
Also, I was scrambling, no pun. I was running a little bit late, but I did drop in the little sci-fi babies, which I think to my credit. Okay, and I'm just dropping that link into the class schedule, and then we are going to be ready to talk about the stuff. That goes there. All right. Sorry for my late start. I'm just kind of been one of those years so far. Okay, link is now on the class schedule, and it is also in the channel. And we've got, let me see, right now we got 3, 6, 9, 10, 11, 12. So I think it's looking like we're actually 12, not 13 bodies. So that's fine. Currently registered is 13. So this is the time where you give a shout out to the person who's not there, who's never going to hear this shout out. So anyway, we'll just assume that there's 12 going, and I'll try to maybe follow through with whoever the missing person is. All right, everyone's got nicknames set up, which is great. Again, I will only call you by your first name. As we get launched, is there any housekeeping stuff, any stuff related to the class or anything of that sort that you guys have any questions or lingering anything? Come on, somebody say something. Throw me a bone here.
I was staying up reading your textbook till 11 last night, and it's an interesting one. I'm liking it so far.
The former skater chick book, the We Don't Have a Name for It book.
We don't have a name for it.
The head first book. It is, if you give it, okay. So Stephen, if you give it its room, right, and you treat it like an episode on Netflix or a couple episodes on Netflix, you know what I mean? I think it settles in. Blake and the audio problems, but that's just Blake, right? Is that, I think we've determined that's just you, Blake?
I'm pretty sure that any audio issues are probably network issues. But that's just my opinion.
That's not bad diagnostics. Okay, all right, friends. Here's what we're doing. We're live. We are going to talk about design patterns, and I think we should just dive straight in. Let me just get this arranged. It is okay. Just one more reminder that with only 12 of you, one of me, interactivity becomes a kind of an important thing. Okay, whether that's comments in the text chat, or whether that's dropping in on the voice, it's super helpful. You know what I mean? Just so we can be a little more live. Okay, patterns ready to rock and roll. This picture, by the way, is just about the creepiest. I like this picture. Okay, and this is important because we'll probably get to it today. Maybe we will, but we're going to get to this topic that I call shiny objects and squeaking doors. Okay. Shiny objects are things that your brain just kind of latches onto and thinks it's cool for some reason, but you don't quite know why. And squeaking doors are things that are bothersome for, and you don't quite know why. And one of the interesting dynamics is when they both converge in one single picture, which I think we got going on here. I don't know, man. It's just, it's just a great picture. I think it's a classic. Moment where your brain just kind of goes, okay, there's something weirdly engaging about this picture. So the question is, what is it? All right, and that's really what we're going to be talking about today as we launch into this idea of patterns. So the whole class is called design. I don't even know what the class is called. It's called design patterns, right? Um, Let me see. Oh yeah, Tobias. Yep. Okay. Thank you, Stephen, for dropping in there and answering that question. Um, yep, and that'll get you access to the book for free. The online book really is decent. I think it flows really, really well. Okay, so the whole class is kind of like it's about, in my mind, it's about design and it's about design patterns. I mentioned this last time, and it's about the Goth patterns. But really, to me, design is a concept of thinking. It's a way of thinking. It's a way of conceptualizing and compartmentalizing and dealing with the world, and it's a method of creating. It's really the process by which we create. I think that if you think about it, there's no design without creativity. And at the end of the day, when we are creative and you're done, it actually looks like design. And I think sometimes we get those two ideas somehow, kind of like separated in our minds, that somehow design is this, very systematic engineering process. And I don't know that it is. I think a lot of times design looks a great deal like art, looks a great deal like a sort of a creative process, right? And clearly one that your brain gets involved in. And so the idea of patterns, I just want to reinforce it's not just the Goth patterns, it's about the general notion of patterns, which influences all of the things that we call design, which is a big part of everything we do in the software industry. Okay. So what I wanted to do, there's a few things I want to try to get to, like the fish story, take this fish and look at it, and the orders of ignorance, and a little bit about me, and maybe we'll get those today. Maybe we won't. There's always a good chance that once I start rocking and rolling, we don't know how long it'll go. But we are going to start first with patterns, okay, and try to get this kind of on the record, okay? Where did this whole thing come from? So the earliest roots of what kind of comes to be known as design patterns, and which turns into fame and fortune for the Gang of Four, has its roots in some ideas that actually go way back. One of those is a thing called literate programming by Donald Knuth, who's a famous, legendary, really, computer scientist. And the idea behind literate programming was it really was the precursor to Java docs, and that idea of embedding things in the code that a preprocessor or a compiler would pull out and use to kind of document. Knuth's idea was that you had to have some way of sort of documenting your code as you built code. And what it really is about is cognition. Okay, and that's really the big takeaway, the surprising takeaway to all of this, if you get down to the roots of what this entire field is about, it's really about cognition. And that has to do with, just how your brain thinks about stuff, right? How it makes sense of stuff. And in particular, it turns out that when you write programs, the biggest struggle is the cognitive process. So what I mean by that is when you're writing code, you have a mental model that exists, and the code is simply an artifact of a model in your head. Okay. And we're building and designing in our minds, and then this code kind of pops out. And then somebody else has to show up, look at the code, which is this lossy artifact, and from that code reconstruct their own mental model. And then one of the byproducts of that is that you have code here, right, which is an artifact of a mental model. We'll call it M1. Over here is M1 prime. It's an altered version of it, right? Because all that happened was the code moved over, and then somebody read the code and then tried to create a mental model in their head from the code. And if you don't have the proper mental model, then you break everything when it's time to make changes and maintain, right? And so literate programming was an attempt to try to understand this idea of embodying code knowledge in a way that was more transferable. Does that make sense? And then this idea of program comprehension, it's a field, kind of really almost a psychological field of study, where the idea is looking just from code, how do you create a mental model in your head? Start if all you've got is the code, because that is a big, big chunk of what professional software engineering looks like, right? Reading code that you didn't write so that you can modify it, so you can change it. So these become the earliest roots. And I hope if you know anything about patterns yet that you're already seeing how this starts to connect into the idea of patterns. But I'm going back to, the 70s for these early studies on the psychology of programming. Later on, there was a phase that the software engineering industry went through, which was kind of about best practices. And what were the state of the art, and then some people, Bob Glass among others, began talking about the state of the practice, because nobody actually practices the state of the art. So the question is, what's the state of the practice? Anyway, and then eventually we kind of moved into this phase where we began to be a little bit more concerned about shared programming and design vernacular, meaning that we've got a shared terminology, and you think about it. If I say that there's a linked list, or I say it's a stack, or I say it's a queue, right? You know what those are. And the reason that you know why is because these are patterns, is why you know that, and you know them by their name. Stack, queue, heap, memory, von Neumann architecture. Just pick any of the terms that are like the terms I'm learning. And it's true of any field. I don't care if you're taking physics or whatever. It's true of any field, that when you come across a term in the vernacular of that field, that term is a pattern. Okay. And that pattern, we'll get down to what we really mean when we say patterns. Now, where all this converges is with a book. Where's my book? Do I have it with me? It's okay. I have slides, but I have my copy around here somewhere. I know where it is. It's upstairs. I'm not going to go get it. But a book by Christopher Alexander, a series of books, actually. Christopher Alexander, I'm sure he's retired by now. I think he's still alive. He was a professor of architecture at Berkeley. And by architecture, I don't mean computer architecture. I mean architecture, buildings, houses, that sort of thing. And he was in search of the philosophical underpinnings of the whole idea of designing, of designing homes, right? Because what Alexander conceptualized, and this becomes really, really critical, okay? What Alexander conceptualized was that in buildings, there is an interplay between our humanity and the structures, right? Again, we'll talk a little more about this, but if you've ever walked into a place and you felt the structures somehow just made you feel like, ah, oh, yeah, I really feel at home here. I want to come and I want to hang out here, right? Why is that? Or other places where you go and even as you're walking in, you're feeling like repulsed by the structures, right? Alexander began to kind of conceptualize why it was that uh, certain buildings had a kind of a timelessness about it, and this eventually led him to write a book called The Timeless Way of Building. And I think this was some of the philosophical roots. And then he began to just try to capture patterns that he found. And these patterns were the patterns that were ideally that were most timeless, right? And most kind of universal. And the idea was if I have a pattern, it doesn't, I can implement it a million different ways and it's never quite the same, right? But it still partakes of that idea of a pattern. So if I say door, right, that's an example of a pattern. If I say for loop, it's also an example of a pattern, right? And there's probably been at least a million different instantiations of the idea of a for loop. Um, and um, sorry, I'm watching the chat. We may want to go into debug mode. I don't know how much of a distraction that's creating, but um, just I don't know. Give it some thought. Um, but the idea is that there's been a million doors created, and everyone's a little different, you know.
You got a question from Blake
Oh, didn't see it. Yeah, Blake.
On your first two bullet points.
Let me see it. Where is it? Is that what oh, there we go. Sorry, man. Yeah, see, it was lost in the traffic of debugging email stuff. Blake, is that what our IDEs read out to help with IntelliSense? So tell me more about, I don't know about IntelliSense as a term. I can make a guess, but I'm not 100% sure. And I don't know exactly what you mean by read out. It is, if you mean the IDEs that'll like color things and give you a little coloration help, that is an aid to try to help you with program comprehension, to look at the code and have its structure kind of jump out a little bit more. Is it, Blake? Is that kind of, I think you're without mic, right, Blake?
IntelliSense kind of gives you suggestions as well, or like auto completes code as well for you.
Okay, right.
It'll bring up like a list of like if you, for example, if you're using an object and you put a period, and it'll come up with all of its methods and attributes,
right?
As in like a drop down menu. And you can kind of like arrow over and hit enter. So
yeah, absolutely. I just didn't know it by that name. You know what I mean? Is that like a trademark name for somebody, or is that the generic term?
I think that's now the generic term because you
okay.
can get IntelliSense for like any language
okay.
now.
All right, fair. It's one of those things that showed up, like 30 years into my career. You know what I mean? So it's like, is that the new term? Because I remember when those kinds of ideas were first even popping out into IDEs, even the notion of an IDE, because back in the day there was an editor and there was a compiler, right? And that was your whole world. And it was sometimes brutally difficult to understand code, right? But yeah, so absolutely right. Yeah, and I've obviously used it. I use Eclipse when I'm doing Java. I use Eclipse, and these are tools that have that. No, that's absolutely right. Okay, so with Alexander, there's the books. I've got my own copies upstairs, but they are fantastic, like really, really fantastic. And I will give you some extra credit. This is a pattern language, the one on the left, was published first because it's really just a catalog. I think there's 254 patterns in the book. And these are patterns at various levels of abstraction. So, for example, there's there are cities, there are towns, communities, streets, houses, rooms, a properly designed and implemented deck, for example. I have a deck here at my house that is the worst deck. I actually will document it, and we will. Oh, awesome, Tobias. Um, I will document it for you sometime. Maybe we'll go live, and I'll just show you the worst deck in the. It's not even a deck. It's a little whatever. It's a little veranda from hell. I don't know what it is. And in contrast, my last home had the best front deck I've literally ever seen. And it was attached to my home. And it had to do, but if you read Alexander's pattern on like front porch or front deck kind of ideas in a pattern language, you'll see all the ways in which my deck in my home in Alpine that I just sold um, actually does those things that Alexander talks about, and how the one I have here in my house in Lehigh does not, and one of them just repels you, and the other one attracts you. And that's the whole idea. And The Timeless Way of Building is a much shorter book. It's still kind of philosophically dense, and the book is not super long, but they tend to be a bit expensive. In fact, if somebody wants to like drop an Amazon link or something on that, their Oxford book, and they come in a really nice bound thing. So they're probably like $50 or something like that. Okay. But if so, I think that I've read both of them cover to cover. Pattern Language is a much bigger journey because it's like more than 1,000 pages and it's 254 patterns. The Timeless Way of Building is a lot more of a philosophical journey, but I read it when I was in grad school in the 90s. And for me, The Timeless Way of Building was kind of a life-changing book. I mean, for a technical book, you know what I mean, outside of the realm of sort of, religion and philosophy, or the things that are like patently supposed to be about life, The Timeless Way of Building was one of those books for me that really truly impacted the way I thought about everything, everything that surrounds me. So anyway, but if you want to make the attempt, acquire the book, spend the money, I will drop some extra credit on you, uh, just because I think it's such a valuable read for anybody. So here was the idea. So what Alexander did was, and by the way, I want to make one comment. I also don't have my Goth book right here. I am hopelessly unprepared today. Um, but I mean, it's around here somewhere. It's probably in my library. But one of the things that I have there, let me back up. I have some things that I take issue with relative to what became the software patterns movement community. It all eventually just seemed to constantly just reduce to Goth. And there were things that happened in that community, which I was part of very early in that whole thing, as was our department chair, Neil Harrison, who was very involved in that community. But no, the extra credit is read the book all the way through. One of them. Again, Stephen, a pattern language is a little too big to bite off in one semester, I think. But The Timeless Way of Building, acquire it, get your hands on one, or buy it and read through it, and that's where the extra credit comes from. Um, so, um, but one of the things that happened in the patterns community, in my opinion, was that there was a very kind of parochial approach that was taken by those who were kind of there first. It was almost like we already figured it all out. Um, yeah, Stephen, if you wanna pony up on this thing and go after it, man, you knock yourself out. The one thing about the pattern language, the a pattern language, is that each pattern is like 3-4 pages, so it is really best taken slowly and digested slowly. You know what I mean? Like a pattern. What I would do, I think I read it in about a year, reading like one pattern every night as I was going to bed. You know what I mean? Sit in bed. I always read in my bed. You know what I mean? And I would just read like one pattern, let it kind of soak. There's certain books like that if you could plow through it, but it's going to turn into wah wah wah. I would read, slowly. Wait. Less than $20? What the heck? Hang on. I'm clicking over. I'm like, okay. Hardcover. Oh, that's Rent. That's Rent. Rent. Come on. No, if you buy it new, it's $40. In my mind, this is a book. It comes like with a little marker thing, you know what I mean? A little built-in cloth. Hang on a second. I am serious. I'm going to be right back. Hold tight. Actually, you can still hear me. I'm just off camera. I'm heading to the location undisclosed where I believe we will find Al Capone's vault and all of its contents. Okay, I have a pattern language.
I get that joke.
Thank you. Somebody throw me a bone here. I have a pattern language, and I thought I had. Actually, given the vertigo, I shouldn't be moving that fast. If you hear a sudden, like a clunk, you know what I mean, and everything stops, then you'll know what happened. Let me see. Okay, this will be good though. At least this one. My timeless way of building. Not sure where that is right now. Okay, I'm coming back now. And also, this is the part where you're like, man, that old man is really out of shape. Whew, whew. Yeah, I had to run a quarter of a mile down the street. That's why I'm so exhausted. Okay. You're like, yeah, all that for that. Yes, okay, but, okay. This is the book. This is my copy. It comes with that kind of like the really nice old style, but the book, okay, 1,171 pages. I'm going to give you an example, but honestly, if you dig architecture, buildings and architecture and that kind of stuff, whoa, there's a PDF version at Cornell? Man, this is awesome. But I do want you to know that in my world, now I am old school, there's no question, but in my world, I am definitely from an older generation, right, where we had okay, here's a good one. You had books, you had hard copy, you killed trees, you stacked them and you put them on your shelf. So I'm definitely from that, I have a certain, romantic attachment. But let me just give you an example of the patterns in here, so you just get a sense of it. Here's one of my very, very favorites. And what the thing is, every one of these that you can talk about, you'll usually recognize it, but you never really knew that it was a thing, right? So, shoot, where'd it go? I thought I had it. And you're like, if you had a PDF, you'd already be there by now. Yeah, shut up. You're right.
Looks like that PDF's not the full book, though.
See,
It
there
only
you
has
go.
313 pages.
That's definitely not the full book. Okay, alcoves. This is how it works. This is how Alexander works. Chapter, usually a picture, black and white. And then what he does is he has like a bolded thing that's kind of the problem statement. See that? And then there's discussion, some pictures and other stuff. And then there's a conclusion, again in bold. So you can just like look at it, but let me give you an example. Alcoves. No homogeneous room of homogeneous height can serve a group of people well. Think about the great room, right? The idea of like the great room architecture, the open architecture, which became popular, right? No homogeneous room of homogeneous height can serve a group of people well. To give a group a chance to be together as a group, a room must also give them the chance to be alone in ones and twos in the same space. Okay. And so that's the problem statement, that you have this need to sort of feel connected, but also a need for a certain level of privacy, right? In other words, you have opposing forces. The force to feel connected, because if you were just like completely isolated, or you had to go down a tunnel and then there was a space down there for two people to meet, you'd feel really weird about that. But if you could somehow get like two chairs facing each other over in a corner, right, in the middle of a family gathering in an otherwise large space, there's a feeling of privacy to that. And it can literally be only a couple of chairs and a lamp or something like that, right? So he sets up the problem and he says, this problem is felt most acutely in the common rooms of a house, the kitchen, the family room, the living room. In fact, it's so critical there that the house can drive the family apart. That's that interplay again between a space and the way we live, right? And I had a house where it was kind of like that. There was a decent living space downstairs, but a fairly narrow hallway or a stairway, you know what I mean, stairwell to go down. And by the time you went down 180 degrees back down a little hall, you'd come out into the other space. In fact, I've had that in my last two houses before right now. And what it did was, when you had a large gathering, you didn't feel connected to the gathering. You felt like you'd peeled off and had abandoned everybody. There was a weird, you know what I'm talking about, right? Um, anyway, and it talks about, that the main function of the family is emotional. These qualities only come into existence if the members of the house are physically able to be together as a family, right? But anyway, to solve the problem, there must be some way in which the members of the family can be together even when they are doing different things, right? He is describing opposing forces, and he refers to them as forces in the Timeless Way of Building. Um, there are conflicting forces, and you have to resolve the forces. And the question is, how do you resolve the force? Now, this is everything we talk about in design. I mean, if I could take like 3 minutes of this entire semester and just encapsulate it and say, please pay attention, this would probably be it. Because most of what happens in crappy design is that a designer, coder, builder, whatever, they found one thing that worked like now, and they latched it down, and then they just went for it. And it solved one problem, but it left unsolved these other problems. What Alexander teaches us is that where you have these conflicting forces, patterns, design patterns, create a way of resolving those competing forces. Okay? Now, if you think about it, every cool, brilliant design partakes of that idea of resolving forces. And sometimes, like the alcove, they're so essential to humanity, that you see them everywhere. Go to a hotel lobby. Just go to random hotel lobby, and I actually have some pictures of a hotel I was in 2019, which was the last time I was in a hotel. Um, but where there was like literally alcoves built like on the front of the thing, they would like poke out, so you could come into the lobby, and then go into a little room with a table, but it was all open, but it was still kind of like a little bump out. Several of those, and you'll see like even in a open room, you'll see two couches facing each other, right? Two chairs over here, and there's positioning that creates a simultaneous feeling of connectivity, and at the very same time, because you can look up and see connectivity, but you only can kind of hear, that sort of little intimacy gradient, right? Okay, so going on here, he says, again, I'm just looking at just a few spots that I've highlighted. People want to be together, but at the same time, they want the opportunity for some small amount of privacy without giving up community. If 10 people or 5 are together in a room and 2 of them want to pull away to one side to have a quiet talk together, they need a place to do it. Only the alcove or some version of the alcove can give them the privacy they need without forcing them to give the group up, without forcing them to give the group up altogether. And then it comes to our little conclusion, and then he has his little hand-drawn pictures. There's his little alcove solution. And he says, as conclusion, make small places at the edge of any common room, usually no more than 6 feet wide, 3 to 6 feet deep, and possibly much smaller. These alcoves should be large enough for 2 people to sit, chat, or play, and sometimes large enough to contain a desk or a table. Okay, that is a brilliant, cool thing. Here's another one, and then I'm going to get off of Alexander. Here's a pattern called window place, right? When you see that, doesn't that kind of make you go, ooh, oh, that would be cool? I mean, it's a little, those are wooden benches, right? But isn't it fun when you have the ability to sit somewhere, read a book or do what you're doing, and there's this view that you can see, right? So anyway, Alexander goes on and on and on, light on 2 sides of a room, ceiling height variety, interior windows, on and on and on, and it's all building architecture. Anyway, I didn't do this previously. I didn't actually bust out Alexander like that before. But the point I'm getting at is that it is this resolving opposing forces, right? I need something that's functional, but I also need something that's beautiful. And when we get into Don Norman and the design of everyday things, Norman rips another extra credit book, by the way, that I will give you extra credit for, unless you have to do it for another class. I mean, if you have to do it, if you're doing it for this class, I don't know if there's another class where they have you read the design of everyday things. I'm not sure. But point I'm getting at, Norman will rip on this idea of everything has to be like aesthetically beautiful, but then compromising functionality. Or it's functional, but you compromise aesthetic beauty. Can you reconcile them? And one of the most among the legendary individuals who managed to find ways to reconcile these ideas, in my view, the first really great one was Walt Disney. Here's to Walt. And the next really, really great one was Steve Jobs. And again, love or hate Jobs, love or hate Apple, doesn't matter to me. Jobs and Walt Disney both had a gift. I've read biographies of both of them. They both had a gift for understanding intuitively that you didn't have to compromise the aesthetic beauty in order to achieve the functionality. And there's some really great stories about Walt Disney. For example, if you ever noticed that if you're at Disneyland, which probably many of you have been to Disneyland, right? If you're at Disneyland, Walt Disney made a study of how far to place garbage cans. Too many garbage cans and you get crazy, right? It's too much garbage. Too few garbage cans and you find yourself walking around holding a hot dog wrapper, right? And not having any place to throw it, or having, you know what I mean? When there are too few garbage cans. So he actually figured out how many steps it took you to eat a hot dog. You know, he would do these kinds of studies, you know, and that even the garbage cans looked nice. It was, you know, this uncompromising desire to resolve the forces and bring them together. When that happens, it really, really looks beautiful, and it those are kind of the world changing kinds of ideas. Okay, so this is from this book. This quote: each pattern describes a problem which occurs over and over again in our environment, and then describes the core solution to that problem in such a way that you can use the solution a million times over without ever doing it the same way twice. Now, that's key. It's really, really key. Because when you have the essential gist of a pattern, that's what you have. One of the things that I struggled with Goth, I mean, I remember when Goth came out. My Goth is a first edition Goth. It was when it was barely brand new, and I bought it and read it, and to me, they kind of co-opted a lot of the ideas and then limited them and then stripped away a lot of the beauty, in my opinion. And that's kind of my main nit relative to what happened in the software design patterns community. For starters, you know, it's not like there's this thing called design patterns and there are no other patterns. Not true. Alexander described towns, buildings, construction, you know, various levels of abstraction. Well, the same thing happens in software, right? There's architectural patterns like client server or model view controller. There's design patterns, which we'll talk, which are what, you know, which is what the skater chick was all about, and Goff is all about. But there's also idiomatic patterns like for loops or conditional statements, you know. So, you know, or iteration is an idiomatic pattern, but you can implement that a lot of different ways. So the notion when we get down to Goff, what I want you to try to think about relative to patterns that we get from Alexander that we lose in Goff, to my chagrin, is we lose the beauty of what Alexander was really trying to do with capturing the essential gist, right? So, oh, nice. Well, we'll take a look at that, Blake. The other thing that comes to my mind is archetypes, you know, literary archetypes, recurring themes that show up in literature, you know, the hero's journey, you know, for example, is an archetype in literature, right? Embodied maybe by the Iliad and the Odyssey by Odysseus, right? Epic poems from Homer. You know, there's these, and then repeated in the Aeneid by Virgil, right? Which was really the Latin, really in essence, almost like the Latin version of the Iliad. But anyway, what am I trying to say? Or the Odyssey, anyway. What I'm trying to say is it is this idea of a generic essence, okay, that is at play. And that's what you're trying to grab onto and capture and understand and remember. When you've got that, then you've really got something, okay? Okay, so that's the idea that I can do this thing a million different ways, and it still partakes of the gist of what that thing is. So I have a little bit of an issue with the idea of even like, how do you implement the strategy pattern? So you need to understand, even though there's code for implementing the strategy pattern, that code is not the strategy pattern, okay? That code is not the strategy pattern. And the original Goth, which was C++, because Java was either not quite out yet, you know, I really thought that these were mostly, it was called design patterns. And I thought, no, it probably should be called quasi-idiomatic patterns for object-oriented C++, you know, code solutions. And so that's very utilitarian, but it doesn't partake of the sort of the spiritual gist of what Alexander's all about. I hope that makes sense. Okay. There's the Goth book. and I dropped in. This is our cover of the new Head First book. I wanted you to just see, if you haven't noticed it already, that this she's got the book right there. She's got the Goth Book right there in her hands. So I just wanted you to note that. That's why I brought her into play. Okay, that's the famous book, 95. Right, when that's about the time that Java was released as a language. So, elements of reusable object-oriented software. That's actually fairly true. But then the term it grew bigger, like suddenly it meant more, but it never really does mean more than that. Okay, so it turns out that some of these early blokes, the Gang of Four, that were, you know, object-oriented practitioners, right? So they had this very tight, connection to object-oriented design, but it didn't have to have any link, right? And so when I was doing my doctoral dissertation, I actually looked at languages, or not languages, but well, yeah, but language paradigms, programming language paradigms across, at the time, the four main paradigms, which were imperative, object-oriented, logic programming, and functional, and tried to sort of look at and embody and capture the essential characteristics of those paradigms as a set of patterns, as a pattern language, basically. And so there's nothing that says patterns are object oriented. Okay, it is a sheer artifact of history. And really, these guys that just happened to be like having coffee one day or whatever, and just discovered that they had all read Christopher Alexander. That was kind of the connection, and they began to say like, "Hey, what can we connect it?" That's really where it kind of starts to pop out in the late '80s. So some of the history. Um, let's see. So here comes a set of definitions of pattern. Okay. The first one we'll give to Christopher Alexander, but understand that as these things began to be, um, co-opted and used and leveraged, other, people began to attach their own definitions. So this is Alexander, right? Each pattern is a three-part rule which expresses a relation between a certain context, a problem, and a solution. Fair, fine. Okay, this is Dirk Reel, who is, I think, very well known. He's also a really good guy. And I think, anyway, Dirk did a lot of writing in the early days about patterns. A pattern is the abstraction from a concrete form which keeps recurring in specific non-arbitrary contexts. That's a little harder to get your head around. But there's some meat in there that's a little bit different than what Alexander said. Okay, Dick Gabriel, who again was did a lot of the early philosophical writings about patterns. And I like Dick Gabriel's definition here. Each pattern is a three-part rule which expresses a relation between a certain context, a certain system of forces, and there you get the forces, which occurs repeatedly in that context, and a certain software configuration that allows these forces to resolve themselves. Okay, that becomes really key, and it's not strictly software, but again, Gabriel wrote some really great essays in the early days of design patterns as software ideas, and was very philosophical about all of that. So I like that. Copeland, who again is a guy who was very prominent in those early days of patterns and in object-oriented programming, in fact. Copeland and Neil Harrison, our chair, wrote a really, really great book on kind of organizational and management patterns, which I highly recommend. We'll talk about it. I can even maybe get Neil to come and guest lecture and talk about some of those patterns, some of that effort in doing that. But anyway, Cope, the pattern foreshadows the product. It is the rule for making the thing, but it is also in many respects the thing itself. That's a little bit metaphysical, but you know what I mean? Cope's trying to kind of say that it's almost like an Aristotelian form, of the thing, So is that the thing, or do you have to instantiate it? It's almost like a definition versus a declaration, but they're really still kind of like the same idea. That sort of a thing. So these are some characteristics of patterns. They solve a problem. It has to be a solution to a problem. And as Alexander lays out, like for example, in alcoves that we read, there's a conflict, opposing forces. I want to be with everybody, but I also need some privacy if a little conversation breaks out. And if you don't have that, right, it gets really awkward. It doesn't resonate with the human experience. It has to solve a problem. There has to be some known it has to be a proven concept that this thing is known to be a workable solution. Alcove exists for a reason. Okay. The solution isn't obvious. Now that's very subjective, right? Because most solutions, when they're first created, are absolutely non-obvious, and then they become the thing, and then they're obvious forevermore. If that makes sense. For example, if I show you almost any patent, software patent, or patent about a software system, and you're looking at it right now and you know the field, most of the time you're going to go, what's your first impression? And you're going to go, my first impression is, that's pretty obvious. Okay, right, great. And that's fair from 2021. Now you're like, oh, but the patent was written in 1993. What was the state of the art in 1993? What was known, what was published, what was what they call the prior art. Oh, that's harder. You know what I mean? So these things sometimes they don't seem, they seem more obvious now when they're well known. That's a natural dilemma. There's some relationship involved, and that there's a human component. Now that one also is funny and a little subjective. In Alexander, the human component is that all of these buildings were used, built, created, occupied by humans. But software is also created and occupied by humans, right? It's either software that we use and it's the product that we're interfacing with, or it's the code, which, the number one audience, this will be a trick question sometime on an exam. The number one audience for software, what do you think I'm going to say? Anybody want to just drop a guess in here? I've been doing a lot of talking. What do you think I'm going to say? Read my mind, students.
Compiler and grader.
Ooh, boy, that's a really student-centric view. No offense.
Let's say that
future devs.
The computer.
In that order, right? So that's where I'm falling out. But really, the compiler and grader, I mean, that is really a student-centric view. And but in the out in the real world, but in industry, the number one audience for the code is another human in any case. Now that could be future dev, or it could be you like 3 months from now, right? And if you've ever I've done this, anybody who's been in the software industry long enough has looked at code and been like, who was the idiot? You know what I mean? And then you go looking and you're like, oh, that was me a year ago, and me a year ago, future Chuck says that current Chuck is an idiot, and that's just called progress and evolution. So that's okay, but I'm just saying, it is, well, it's always really truly future dev, right? Because even if it's for yourself, it's for yourself in the future. And what you're trying to do is embody what you've done, right, in that code for comprehension by somebody else in the future. Maybe you, maybe someone else, right? So that there's absolutely a human component, right? And one of the things we're going to talk about, I was about to say, we're going to talk about use cases and you're going to get sick of use cases. But I don't think you're going to get sick of use cases, because I don't think that if your heart is in the right place, I don't think you can get sick of use cases, because that is the part where everything converges in the human component. The rule of three, I think it was Cope who actually posed the rule of three, and I buy it / don't buy it. I buy it in the sense that these sorts of things you can you'll see that other people have done it. I like that. I like that just fine. But Alexander also said that you could create solutions that had never been done before that then become a pattern, right? So I'm not a strict adherent to the rule of three. I understand the motivation. I just don't strictly buy it. Okay. I did mention this, and by the way, again, I'll keep saying this, but again, please, as we've got, ideas and questions and, whatever, please drop in. Okay, jump in and make your comments or questions or whatever, or drop your. I'm going to take a look at Disney's reused scenes a little later. I talked about architecture patterns, design patterns, and idioms. Okay. Start with Alexander's quote from The Timeless Way of Building. When we use the network of a language, we always use it as a sequence going through the patterns, moving always from the larger patterns to the smaller, always from the ones that create the structure to the ones that embellish those structures, and then to those which embellish the embellishments, right? It's sort of like a stepwise refinement is what Alexander is really saying. But he is absolutely talking about hierarchy. And I've had conversations, like in-person conversations or, email threads or whatever, conversations with people in the patterns, software patterns, design patterns community, who were just saying things like, client server is not, whatever, that's not a pattern, or for loop is not a pattern. And I'm like, no, bullcrap. It might not be a design pattern, but it might be an idiomatic pattern, or it might be an architectural pattern, or it might be some other, taxonomy, but still be a pattern. In other words, what we don't need to do is get an idea, get a term like pattern, and then take all this beauty that took this much space, plus The Timeless Way of Building, plus a bunch of other books by Alexander, which I have. I've got a whole stack of books that were like his magnum opus, signed by him, right there on that shelf. And then later on, I can prove it if anybody wants me to go grab one. But Alexander put all this philosophical beauty onto it. Why do we then have to go, that's not a pattern, that's not a pattern? Why would we do that? What's the why? I just don't understand it, honestly. And I've seen it done a lot, but it's that narrowing that then loses information. It loses representational power. And in my view, it is my opinion that the pattern languages, the plop community, the patterns community, and the software field cost themselves over time. And this is 25-year hindsight. But it was things I was saying 20 years ago, that it was so sort of parochial. It was so gated community, the whatever, the patternistas were going to figure out all the knowledge and they would then bestow it on everybody else, because that way they could continue to be the core group in the knowledge base. Not a very inviting community unless you were doing things that fed what they were doing. But if you rolled in and had questions about, the fundamental ideas and questioned those, now you would run afoul of that community. And I always felt like it had really created a very dead and stagnant sort of, ultimately a very stagnant community, which I think ultimately really underachieved in terms of its actual potential. And eventually it was all built, eventually it all just turns into Goth. Oh, mighty Goth. There's that became the thing, and Goth is great. And I think it's an incredible contribution to the field of software engineering. But I don't think it's all that, considering what Alexander did and how much of that was just left on the floor, in pursuit of somebody's vision. That's my rant about that. Okay, architectural patterns. How are we doing on time? We're doing great on time. Yeah. We got 15 minutes. Okay, architectural patterns. There was a book by Bushman et al. Bushman and everybody. I think that Dirk Reel was one of these, one of the authors on this one. This was sometimes called the PASA book, which is pattern-oriented software architecture. These guys, I'm feeling like a doof because I have all these books, and I think mine is like down the hall. I'm not going to go do the journey again. But it was about architectural patterns, and I like this book. It's a really good book. An architectural pattern expresses a fundamental structural organization or schema, right? A set of predefined subsystems, the responsibilities, rules, guidelines, right? The relationships. So if I say client server, you know that there's a client somewhere and that there's a server somewhere, that the server offers services, that the client, that the client approaches the server, right? But client server is an ancient pattern of architecture. You go to the hot dog vendor, right? You go to J Dogs and you drop your $5 or whatever, they are the server. What do you call somebody who, we used to call them waiters and waitresses, and now what do we call them in restaurants? Ding, ding, ding. We call them servers because they serve you food, right? And it's the service industry, food service. We come in as clients and we issue a request, and then that server returns a result back to us, and there's some exchange of information. That's a ancient pattern. Protocol stacks are a pattern. As I said, model view controller, which we'll talk about, is a pattern. This one was Dirk Reel, a conceptual pattern. He referred to these as conceptual patterns, right? A pattern whose form is described by means of terms and concepts from an application domain. That to me is a little bit weaker, but these are some classic architectural patterns. I mentioned protocol stacks, layers, pipes and filters, like digital signal processing, and we mentioned client server, brokers. Again, there's a lot of architectural patterns. Web app at some level is an architectural pattern. You could think of it that way. Issues that involve cloud-based computing. There's a lot of that is going to be even the cloud itself as a very high-level architectural kind of idea, right? And involves a lot of other concepts. Design patterns. So that's the high level. Design patterns is the middle ground. So here's Bushman, who says a design pattern provides a scheme for refining the subsystems or components of a software system. Recurring structure of communicating components. Okay. So fine, it's designing certain kinds of designs. Dirk Reel again. Something that uses software design constructs like objects, classes, inheritance, aggregations, things like that. Fine. And then the classic design patterns are Goth, but they're not limited to Goth. And then we get to idiomatic patterns, which I've already mentioned. Again, Bushman's, for my money, Bushman gives the best definitions of all of these. An idiom is a low-level pattern specific to a programming language. Ish. An idiom describes how to implement particular aspects of components or the relationships between them using the features of the language. That's fair, but then here's my question. In fact, noodle on this for a second. Noodle with me, will you? If I say the for loop in Python, clearly that matches this definitions. But what about iteration, right? Iteration as a generic idea. Every language has some, not every language has inherent in the language itself, but many, and every object-oriented and imperative language has this notion of iteration, which is typified by the for loop, right? But doesn't have to be. Like there was like a do loop, a repeat until, the while loop, the for loop, just flat out go to statements. And what about, let's give good old assembly language its due, right? And setting up all the little registers and doing a little check and testing and branching on some condition and dropping out if not, right? And iterating, X number of times, right? You can do an iteration in every language that supports iteration. But I don't know. So let me ask you this. Let me go interactive for a second here, because I'm feeling mighty lonely, like I've been really talking head here. What do you think? Iteration. I'm not talking about the C++ if statement, or the C++ for loop. I'm talking about iteration. Design pattern or idiomatic pattern? What say you, my friends? And no right or wrong here. I just want to, and you can drop it in the chat as well. What do you think? Balake says that iteration would be idiomatic. Confirm or deny? Who's and what's the alternative? I guess design pattern, right? What do you think? Come on, don't put it all on Balake. And you can drop in the voice as well. Mitch says idiomatic. We got two votes. You want to just throw votes? Want to just drop quick votes? Because honest, to be really, really honest, I don't know concretely myself. You know what I mean? What do you think? I want to get a few more votes down. Are all of you asleep? Come on. Come on. Wake up. Braden, both. Yeah. Okay.
My computer disconnected in the middle of your question. Could you ask it again?
Yeah, man. The question is iteration. Is that, and it's kind of based on these definitions we've been looking at. Is that idiomatic? Is that an idiomatic pattern or a design pattern? And here's the struggle, which I think we're getting at. Bushman, and again, I like Bushman. I like this book a lot. This says that it's using the features of a given language. Now that kind of makes some sense, right? Because, for example, there probably some of you might have English as a second language and have maybe learned other languages, right? Starting from English. What's the biggest problem? What's the biggest struggle? Especially if somebody's learned English, I'd love to hear your view on this. I have done my own little, research over time talking to people. But, what is the hardest thing about learning English?
Ambiguity.
Sure. Yeah. But there's a lot of that in all natural languages, right? More in English.
True.
There's probably more in English. On the other hand, there are functions in the grammar in English, like articles.
Maybe that we don't follow rules very well.
No, that's just illiteracy. I think that's common. I think illiteracy is a common affliction everywhere. Braden asked,
Well, I think what he was saying, as far as not following rules, is I've only studied a little bit of another language, but when the rule was there, the rule was there. There was never like I jumps over this and makes this one say its name. Oh, but that doesn't work in some words. That's only in most words. It's like our rules are more rule of thumb in common, but we break our own rules all the time because we are, taken from 12 different languages and slapped together.
Yeah. Now, what's interesting about that is most of that slapped together stuff isn't grammatical. It's more vocabulary. You know what I mean? Because the grammar is really, very much that sort of Germanic descent from Old English. The grammar itself in English is not crazy complex. You know what I mean? The actual grammar. I mean, when I first started learning Italian, no, Sam, so we could be talking about iteration versus recursion. Absolutely. When I first started to learn Italian, I was blown away by how many tenses there were, right? I got present tense, future tense, there's a past tense, there's a past recent, there's a past remote, like a past ancient tense that's different. There's all these different conditionals. And we have those too in English, except for the past ancient. But we would say, I go, you go, he goes, she goes, right? There's a few variations. We go, they go. We would go, I would go, he would go, she would go, and you get that sort of conditional by just dropping some of the words. But it's not like, you know, whatever, like, in Italian, io parlo, tu parli, lei parla, noi parliamo, voi parlate, you know what I mean? Loro parlano. And that's just like six different, what are these? They're not tenses, individuals, well, there's a name for it, right? In one tense. And then when we go past, there's like, I don't know, 10 or 12 of these tenses times six, and you get like 50 different, like they're literally that many different words to just simply conjugate the verbs. So conjugating verbs in English, not that hard. Okay, that's what I'm getting at. And depending upon where you're from, you might get real simple on the conjugation, right? I was, you was, we was, they was. That's back to that breaking the rule thing. Okay, here's what I'm getting at. The biggest problem with learning English is idiomatic expressions, in my opinion. And I'm okay being wrong on this if someone's got, some other evidence or personal experience. Idiomatic expressions. We say things in our language all the time, and it really relates to that ambiguity, right? It really is related to that idea of ambiguity, right? If are you bad or are you good? Right, like, are you pulling my leg, right? And what do we call those? Anybody know? I will tell you because we're about out of time. They're called idiomatic expressions. Yeah, see where I was going? Um, they're called idiomatic expressions. They are very particular to the language. They're very particular, right? So really, really, we're right, Braden. It's really, really weird. But it's not even that, because pulling my leg is like an expression, that like, and that all languages have these kinds of things. You know what I mean? Like in Italian, if somebody's like really cool, you say they're molto in gamba. They're in leg. They're in leg. It's very in leg, and it's just goofy and stupid or whatever. But that's what it means. That's an idiomatic expression. So that's tough. But in English, we do it all the time. We have creative language. Part of it is the vocabulary that's so broad. We've got, a single idea, and there'll be like 5 synonyms that all come from different places. You know what I mean? Like, what's the difference between an aardvark and an anteater? Somebody want to answer that one? And the answer has to do with Afrikaans as a language and where the animal eating these ants is located. Is it in South Africa or is it somewhere else? What's the difference between an alligator and a crocodile? I mean, we get these things, you know what I mean? Why do we have one name for the meat and one name for the animal, right? Why does a pig produce pork and a cow produces beef? We'll have to talk to the French and the English about that, right? I'm just saying, so there's a lot of that vocabulary madness, but even the expressions we use, the idiomatic expressions, we drop it into our language, like right there, I just said drop it into. We drop it into our language. We have in English, there's a very non-literal way of speaking and communicating, and you have to become fluent at the idiomatic expressions or you're just lost. And I know that I'm probably one of the worst when it comes to like just speaking in that way. And I think in some respects that can be difficult if somebody is non-native English speaker. Idiomatic expressions. Okay, so what I want to do, we're kind of like pretty much out of the time. I'm going to skip over this one. That's Dirk Reel again, and then idiomatic patterns. So in conclusion, I think that that iterator, I'm going to say that it's an idiomatic pattern, but in doing so, I'm going to deviate from the Bushman definition. I don't know even what would I call a for loop then? A C++ syntactic for loop. I would probably call that a language specific pattern. or a language or an instantiation of an idiomatic pattern. You know what I mean? But it is a gray zone. I totally agree that if I had to put a gun to my head, I would probably say it was an idiomatic pattern. Because I don't think it's a design pattern. It's because it's too utilitarian. You know what I mean? It's like pocket knife, fork, spoon. You know what I mean? Chopsticks. These are very much idiomatic kinds of patterns, even though you might have different ways of doing it in your culture or your country or whatever. Okay, so here's what I'm going to do. We're going to stop right now, and we are on slide number 23. So I'm going to. I always forget. So I'm going to put a note. So this is for Monday, and what is Monday going to be? What's the date today? I don't even know. Um,
Monday is the 18th, and it's Martin Luther King Day.
Not Monday. Wednesday.
20th.
The 20th. All right. Awesome. Thank you. On the 20th, we are on slide 23, and I am sticking this Post-it note right here with all my other Post-it notes in a madness of Post-it note. But that way we'll remember where we are. What we're going to do when we come back, so Monday, Martin Luther King Day, I want to just, I guess since, yeah, I'm not going to see it until after that. I just want to say, given all the crap, given all the everything that's just exploding all over our country and around the world, I have been reading the autobiography of Martin Luther King. I highly recommend it. I believe, it is my belief that if the principles taught, I'm just going to go philosophical for just a second, that if the principles and practices taught by Martin Luther King for political change, oh yeah, to bring about political change, and Martin Luther King cites his two major inspirations are Gandhi and Jesus. And I think if you lump those three blokes together, Jesus, Gandhi, Martin Luther King, if everybody did it the way they did it, we would have peace breaking out all over. I really truly believe we would. And I think that to me, Martin Luther King is a Junior Day as a holiday shouldn't, really is not a wasted day. And I think we need it more than ever. So this is more of a 305G speech, but I just want to say in advance of Martin Luther King Day, take an opportunity to actually drop in and see what this guy actually was about. Because I don't think anybody on any side of the political spectrum is doing what that guy said, right? It's like right now, 2020, there's very little to be seen anywhere that resembles what Dr. King taught. And man, I think we need it. So that's my sermonette about Martin Luther King on Monday. Okay, I really do encourage you to read something, find something, So that's my little spiel, little inspirational spiel. Let's see. Braden's got. So what the deal? Did you hit the library or something, Braden, or is that your own copy or?
I hit the library. I lost you a little bit because of
Okay.
losing service.
Nice.
But I'll just catch up on the YouTube video.
Yeah, no, it's fine. That's fine, man. That's nice. Your own copy. Yeah, and I want to just say this last thing, really. So Braden just said, he's definitely used inappropriately a lot. I think he's not used at all. That's my problem. Really, really. You know what I mean?
Well, what I was referring to is you'll hear people on both sides say, like, is this the dream that Martin Luther King had? And it's just like, you even know what he meant by that? Like,
no, exactly.
They use it to push their own agendas, not to actually advocate for something.
I agree. Yeah, and we can talk more about it. Again, it's a 305G topic for sure. And one of the reasons that I started reading the autobiography of Martin Luther King Jr., and also I have a book that is it's basically a collection of all the major speeches, and I have audio of all the major speeches. And I just set about some time back to be like, okay, well, really, truly, what did he say? You know what I mean? Like, I know everybody knows I have a dream speech, right? But what, you know what I mean? I wanted to acquire the literacy And in part so that the next time I did try to have an intelligent conversation and somebody was like, blah, 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 whatever, that I could say, have you read Martin Luther King's speeches? All of them? Because I have. Yeah, it doesn't make me, it doesn't make my understanding perfect. It certainly doesn't make me perfect, but it does give me a little bit more of an understanding of what he was at least saying, even though obviously there's going to be cultural differences that make it very difficult to say, oh yeah, I know exactly. But the truth is nobody in 2020 knows either unless they were there. You know what I mean? Unless they were like a teenager or, you know what I mean? Unless they were alive at the time, even the people today, irrespective of culture, race, ethnicity, whatever, you'd also don't quite know what it was like back then, and I certainly don't. Anyway, a little bit of speechy, but anyway, take the opportunity. That's all I have to say about that. So, and yeah, Sam, there are, but they're getting older. You know that, right? I was too young to remember those things happening live. And I'm over 60, so I'm just saying, and I'm nearly dead. So I'm just saying. They're older and they're getting fewer and further between. So, all right, my friends, we are, and I think by the way that we are I'm just checking the count. Yeah, we're more than halfway through that thing, which is just fine. Spending at least 2 days in this stuff here, 2 to 3 class periods is totally fine for what I'm trying to do with this kind of material. I hope this was interesting and valuable to try to set some foundation for why we're talking about patterns. And in the meantime, jump in and we're going to keep rototilling the schedule, getting stuff pulled together, me and Devin and Tim. So on that note, stay out of trouble, stay safe, and I will see all of you. No, you will all see me on Wednesday, and we will converse, and I will upgrade my memes to 2021. It will never happen again, I promise. But it is still a good meme. All right, my friends.
Thank you very much. I'm on your wait list for 305G to see if I can get in, but we'll see.
Check in. I'm going to go look again. Let me check again because I think they were going to do a little bumpity bump. So go take a look, okay? When was the last time you checked?
Oh, I just got on the wait list today, actually.
Oh, just did today. Okay.
I think I was the first person on there. So
okay.
If someone does get bumped, I will probably be taking.
Well, actually, hold on for just a minute, Braden. I'm going to shut down the feed, and I'm going to just tell you, a couple quick things, okay? So hold
I've got a class that's starting in 5 minutes, so
do your class.
I'll keep
I'll update
looking at it.
Yeah, man. Okay.
Thank you very much.